Hello and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
And welcome to the show. The show was recorded in the year 2021.
Yeah, we're in the future.
We're in the future. Or, well, actually, no, because you're probably listening to this in 2021. And we recorded this during, the sixth day of 2021? So,
Yep,
2021 is not even like a year old. You know, it's a week, not even a week old. So, you're listening to this, you're months into 2021. So, technically, we're coming from the past. And we're talking to you people who are in the future. In fact, it's interesting to think whenever you record a document like this, I mean, technically, Randall, this could live for hundreds of years.
Yeah, sure. This will be around for hundreds, maybe thousands of years.
Thousands of millennia. So, I mean, it's weird to think that we think, wow, we're now finally living in the future. But as that popular meme goes, from this day on, hindsight is 2020. Literally 2020. You know what movie took place in the year 2021?
What?
Mad Max.
Yeah, that's a great movie. It's all about peak oil and how that'll affect our civilization. I guess it didn't really come to pass yet.
Well, instead of oil, it was toilet paper. It was really close.
It was peak toilet paper. Yes.
It was toilet paper and hand sanitizer and yeast. That's if you're really going to make Mad Max, it should be about people searching for yeast. Anyway, Randall and I were both big science fiction geeks, which I know is really surprising if you've been watching the show or if you look at me. And growing up, I grew up I'm 55, so I mean I have some early memories of the late 60s, but I grew up in an era where not only was there science fiction movies, but there was also, space exploration and calculators and computers which used these big wide tapes and, the Bionic Man and, Logan's Run and and robots and, the future was a very interesting, it was all over the place. You're 10 years younger than me, but even when you were growing up, I guess, in the 70s and 80s, especially the 80s, there was a lot of futuristic stuff that you got excited by?
I was kind of a cynic growing up. I didn't even think the internet was going to be very big. I mean, but the internet ended up being huge. When I was younger, too, I kind of went to film school at USC. And when I was there, this whole idea of digital video, a lot of people didn't think it was going to happen. I mean, it didn't exist yet. The technology wasn't there. But now there's no film anymore.
Yeah. So, but when you were a little kid, when you were like a small boy, did you like stories about robots and spacecraft?
Well, yeah, of course. I love science fiction movies and stories. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm like, were you like a Star Trek guy or a Star Wars guy?
Well, as a kid, I love Star Wars toys, played with them a lot, but we didn't really have the movies. I didn't really see the movies. I mean, I had the record player, the little record player that told me the story of Star Wars, but I never saw the movies. I mean, I didn't have a VCR. VCRs didn't exist. I mean, the only way I'd see Star Wars is if it came on TV, Chris. I played with the toys. I played with the toys, and then I watched Star Trek on TV.
I remember when I was 10 years old, which is the year you were born, in 1975, all of a sudden, people were realizing that there's only 25 years left in the 20th century. And we were all very excited because I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be 35 in the year 2000. And, I'm going to have a jetpack and I'm going to have my own robot maid. And I'm going to have a bionic arm, and it's going to be really cool. When you were like a small boy in the 80s, did you have like a vision of what you thought the 21st century was going to be like?
even as a child, I was pretty cynical. I just thought that uh, nothing much was going to change. I didn't
So
really
you were
think.
more of a dystopian kind of guy.
I was more of a nothing's going to change kind of guy. But
Okay.
a
Well,
lot of things have changed. I would say well, not a lot, but there's been some changes. I mean, the internet's
yeah,
the biggest thing. I mean, the internet has proved to be like the second coming of the printing press,
I hear
and
you.
it's
So
had all sorts of changes. It's created all sorts of changes.
the show today is about how the arts and entertainment, works of art, stories really, written in the past, sometimes the not too distant past, sometimes even in the 19th century, how they thought the future was going to play out, and specifically our relationship to technology. And Randall and I both chose three stories. I think both of us chose a book, and then we both chose two movies. So one of the books, the book I chose, has also been made into a movie a few times. So we took these particular works because we really we really thought they had something to say about what the future would be like. And specifically, we really thought it was fascinating. And this is a lot of science fiction, deals with our relationship to technology and how that would play out over time. We picked six works. First one, Randall, you picked is a novel by Edward Bellamy.
Yeah, this is a novel. It was published in 1888. That's before the 1900s. It's in the 1800s.
Called Looking Backwards, right?
It's called Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887. It's about a guy who falls asleep in 1887 and he wakes up in the year 2000. And it has a thin story. The book is just an excuse to take this guy around 2000 era civilization and show him how things have changed. And so Bellamy is situated right there in the midst of the first industrial revolution, seeing all the horrors of it, seeing the income inequality, seeing the people starving in the streets, seeing just how everything, even though there's all these wonders of technology that are being invented, it doesn't seem like civilization's benefiting. It doesn't seem like the most of the people in civilization are benefiting. So Bellamy creates a modern world, a world in the future where we've used civilization or used technology to make civilization much better than it was in 1887.
It's interesting because I think most science fiction really starts, the most contemporary science fiction starts in that period of, mid 19th century to late 19th century England and America. Jules Verne, Orson Welles, H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, R.U.R, the robot story from, that's the very first year of the 20th century. But there's a lot of, as the Industrial Revolution is increasing machines and automatization, you start seeing writers writing about that. And it's interesting because in the early 19th century, there was a French philosopher named Auguste Comte, and we associate him with a term called positivism. And it's the study of society that relies specifically on scientific evidence, such as experiments and statistics, to reveal the true nature of how society operates. So you start seeing the scientific principles being applied to things like Sigmund Freud, who trained as a doctor, starts applying scientific principles to the human mind. In every element, there's a feeling that you can address things that had been originally treated either by priests or poets or any other group, and just start using scientific principles to increase production, scientific principles to make a better society, a better state. And I know a lot of people, when they look at this book, this really feels like the codification of where, if we keep on going with this positivistic approach of applying scientific principles to non-scientific elements of human existence, we can make a more perfect and better society. Now, this book, I know you don't agree with this, so I want to hear your thoughts on this. Many people believe that this book was the first book to really advocate socialism in fiction.
Well, Yes, it does. It advocates socialism, it advocates the government taking a larger hand in the economy. The thing I want to say about this book is what's striking to me. I think everybody should read it. It's a great blueprint of what actually happens. I mean, I feel this book really does a better job at predicting the future than almost any other work. This is the greatest futurism work ever written, I think, because.
But you don't think it's socialist?
Let me finish, Chris. Well, no, it is socialist, but it is a form of socialism that has come to pass because the kind of non-socialism, the kind of laissez-faire that was practiced in 1887 was a complete hands-off. The government has complete hands-off on the economy. Fast forward to today. I mean, there's a lot of people would say, the U.S. economy is not a socialist economy. But the U.S. economy is a socialist economy. I mean, compared to 1887, every economy in the world is socialist compared to 1887. The changes this book advocates, the changes this book wants, they've happened. I mean, the government now takes a huge hand in controlling the economy for the benefit of the masses of civilization, the masses of society. If you go back to if we had continued the same kind of structures as in 1887, we would still have masses of people starving in the streets, a bunch of people that are super rich, and the super rich people dictating everything. The super rich people saying, well, I know that the 80% of people are starving in the street every day, but you know what? That's just because that's how God wants it. The end. That's the civilization we would have today.
It's interesting because Marx himself was a big believer in the Industrial Revolution. He liked technology, but what he wanted was automation to replace the worker so that the worker would have more time for personal self-development. So you're right in that, and certainly Bellamy was very much familiar with the writings of Marx. In my research, I found out that there have been sequels to this. This book, by the way, was still a best-selling book in 1935. I mean,
that really tells you how futuristic, how far-seeing this book was.
This book was published in China. It was in the 1920s. I mean, this is an international bestseller that remained an international bestseller all over the world for 50 years. It was in every language. Reading clubs called Bellamy clubs were started. Political movements were inspired by this book. I don't think any book ever written as a work of fiction has done more to promulgate reform, social reform. And they keep on rewriting sequels to this. There is a woman who wrote a version of this that just came out in 2020, where she travels back in time and she talks about a UBI. So I mean, even like you think about it, at the time of this writing, the government has sent people $600 checks. And they maybe you got it by the time.
Yeah, the UBI might come to pass. I mean, there is real serious talk about a UBI in this industrial age. I just want to make sure I say one thing about this book is the genius of this book is that Bellamy, instead of looking at technology as sort of imagining what it will become, what will be invented, Bellamy is imagining how we can use technology to make life better for everyone. And that is the genius of the book. And that's something that, I think a lot of people, especially at that time, even today, just don't think about. People just don't think about that stuff.
Well, it's really the radical notion isn't just that he's talking about technology in the hands of people, but he's talking about technology in the hands of government. And he's talking about how technology can be used by our leaders to build a fair and just society, one that allows people, as Marx wanted, the development of oneself and liberty and freedom. And that's why many people consider that book to be the first, or certainly one of the earliest utopian novels. And as we get into the beginning of the 20th century and World War I and the rise of both worker revolts, the Soviet Union, things become much more complicated, and we start to see what I would call the early dystopian novels. There's one written by a Russian dissident in 1924. It was written in 22, but It's published in English in 1924 called We by Eugene Zamyatin, which deals with a one world state and technology as an oppressor. Aldous Huxley, sorry, not Aldous, Huxley. What's his first name?
Yeah, that's right, Aldous, right?
Aldous Huxley writes Brave New World in 1932, where he deals with a society that prays to Ford, where people are.
That's the guy that made the cars.
Yeah, that's right. People are genetically enhanced and modified and stratified, and you see what the difference between those who live in a pristine civilization versus those who don't. There's another work that I'm literally leaping over, but we'll get to later. And I'm literally leaping over it now because I want to get to it later because we'll deal with it. But in those two dystopian novels, society's use of technology is as oppressor, as is to devalue the human spirit. But I still think the best book on this topic, the one that I think really has entered the vernacular all over the world, it's why I have this background behind me, was written in 1948, comes out in 1949, by George Orwell, and it's 1984. Orwell, he understood socialism and capitalism, and he's one of those clear-headed thinkers. By the way, don't just read Animal Farm in 1984. I know all of you have read Animal Farm in 1984, okay? Read, his essays. He was smart. He was clever. He was funny. He didn't buy into any ideology too seriously. He saw the problems. And there's a lot you can say about 1984. It's too big a book. We could do a whole show on it. But the thing that I just want to relate to in this show is the way that technology is used to oppress people. Up until there's really, I think what's really nice, Randall, about looking backwards is it shows how technology can improve our lives. And in many ways, right, that's really the selling point of all new tech, right? How can I make your life better? And certainly as early as the Industrial Revolution, and as soon as I go back on Amazon after this is done, there's a new gadget or gizmo to make my life better. But Orwell isn't the first one to write about how technology can be used to control our lives, but he really gets into how it can be used in such a pernicious way. And so the basis is it's a totalitarian dystopia. Society it takes place in a place called Oceania, which used to be London, in the year 1984. There are two other nations. Oceania is always at war with one and allies with the other. The leader of the world, of Oceania, is a guy who's referred to as Big Brother. The protagonist is a guy named Winston Smith, who works in the Ministry of Truth. And he is secretly keeping a diary of his thoughts, because in this world, thoughts that are seditious, thoughts that speak of rebellion are a crime. Now, again, it's interesting to think about this because in 1949, computing was, it's the very beginning of computing as we know it today. Television is just beginning, but for the most part, that technology is very, very nascent. But in this world, there are TV screens everywhere, computers everywhere, cameras watching you, microphones recording you, all day, all night. Political messages are literally being blasted in every part of your waking space.
Does that sound familiar?
Does it sound familiar?
I mean, I've been thinking about this for years. Somebody should remake 1984 for the internet age, where it's not a mirror hanging on your wall like in 1984. It's actually your cell phone.
Oh yeah,
that's really. I mean, your cell phone's literally watching you all the time, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's broadcasting to you, but at the same time, it's watching you. So technology is both filling our brains with fabricated thoughts, filling that space of our own ability to think, and it's also observing everything we do and recording it. And then even the way language, and it's weird to say this, that language is technology, but language is technology because there's this thing he creates called newspeak, and it's a way of controlling facts, right? What is
The government is creating a language to control your thoughts, and then
Yeah.
they're going to outlaw the old language, so that you can't think the old thoughts.
And that's just that. But Orwell understood that technology propagates language. So yes, the way you start thinking, the words that enter your lingua, they don't come to you because of what you read in school or what your parents told you growing up. No, they come into you because you're watching TV, you're reading a book, you're listening to a song, a movie. But look, even when you and I have a discussion today about what's going on in the world, we're going to use the terms that the media has told us to use.
Yeah, just let me say a couple things. Like, Orwell didn't come up with all this stuff on his own. I mean, he was carefully looking at how governments were controlling their people at the time. Propaganda had just been invented, like, I want to say in the 1920s, maybe previous to that for World War I. Bernays wrote a book. Bernays he invented the term propaganda. There's a book called Propaganda. It came out in the 20s. So Orwell is taking from all these things. He's seeing how totalitarian governments, even democracies, by the way, are using new technologies to control their people, and he's projecting these techniques into a future with better technology. And he's right. I mean, this is far seen. This book is far seen, isn't it, Chris?
It's so far seen. There was a film they made in the 1950s. Don't bother watching it. It's the cheesiest science fiction movie. It has no meaning or anything. But in 1984, director Michael Radford filmed an adaptation of 1984 starring John Hurt. And it's the last film, by the way, of Richard Burton, who plays O'Brien, who's inherently the state interrogator who tortures Winston Smith in Room 101. But that's less... Well, actually, the devices that they use to coerce him are exactly the kind of devices that that we used in what
Abu Ghraib.
Yeah. So, wow, really, it is a very depressing. It's a satire, folks. Ha ha ha. Really funny. But my point is, it was filmed in London in 1984, the real London in real 1984. The technology is just whatever exists at that day. I think they do a little retrofuturism on the computers to make them look even stranger, but everything else, the helicopters, the clothing, everything about it is contemporary enough that you can see just how much of 1948 is in 1984. How much of the world that Orwell, as you commented so succinctly, is reflecting, and how it just gets worse. A film that kind of came out a year later that just kind of made me think it's almost like a sequel to 1984 is Brazil by Terry Gilliam. Did you ever see that?
Yes, I've seen it.
Yeah, where a man, because of a typo, is recorded as a political dissident. And again, you see how the technology just runs amok.
I think Brazil is more of a comedy, and I think the horror of Brazil is you imagine a 1984-like society, but there's no one actually running it. It's just like a massive bureaucracy that just doesn't care about the people underneath it, the people's whose lives it's impacting, and you just get caught in it. I mean, it's very British.
Yeah, I mean, there's class stratification, 84, whereas Smith lives in poverty and most people do. O'Brien, who's a party apparatchik, has access to all the things no one can have. And we're going to get back into class stratification in a bit, but we're actually going to make a departure to what I consider to be, I don't think it's a utopian or dystopian. I think it's really what comes after, which is I would call sci-fi modernism. I feel like this particular film really gets, I'm not saying it gets out of the politics. I think it has a lot of politics in it, but it just shows the world. Anyway, it's 2001, A Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick, based on the stories of Arthur C. Clarke, and co-written by Arthur C. Clarke. And it's really important that when we discuss this, you can talk about the Kubrickian aspect. Let me talk about Clarke for a minute. Clarke, it was a science fiction writer. He was also considered a futurist. His greatest concerns as a writer, besides being a very spiritual man, was how did realistic technology play out? He really wanted to make spaceflight and any of the computer technology be as accurate as possible. He would talk to designers and engineers. He did a lot of research. Originally, Kubrick wanted to make a space film, and Clarke was brought in later down the line when it came time to work on developing a story. But let's talk a little bit about Kubrick.
Okay. Well, Kubrick, he was a photographer and a director, and he's obsessed with visuals. You watch 2001. It's one of the best examples of that whole futuristic aesthetic where everything is clean and and round and perfect looking. And what else did you want me to say about Kubrick?
He is about production design. I just thought 205.
Oh yes. So 2001 is one of the first like real super accurate space movies. Science fiction movies where Kubrick tries to make everything seem super realistic. I want to mention a movie here too. There's a movie in 1968, I think, called Countdown.
Yeah.
That comes out like a year before 2001, I think. I think sometimes it's cited as 1967. Anyway, it is also very super accurate. And both these movies are coming out right before America visits the moon.
Yeah,
and
in fact,
so they're both trying to depict our trip to the moon in the most realistic fashion possible, and they're both very good, actually.
Yeah, I wanted to just mention this is a fact. It was actually recorded like they started filming the movie 2 days after I was born, December 29th, 1965. So, but after pre-production began, I'm now just literally reading out of a Wikipedia. So sorry. Kubrick saw To the Moon and Beyond, a film shown in the Transportation and Travel Building at the 1964 World's Fair. It was filmed in Cinerama 360 and shown in the Moon Dome. Kubrick hired the company that produced it, Graphic Films Corporation, which had been making films for NASA, the U.S. Air Force, and various aerospace clients, as a design consultant. Graphic Films, Kahn, Peterson, Lester Navarros, and background artist Douglas Trumbull, who would go on to have an amazing career, airmailed research-based concept sketches and notes covering the mechanics and physics of space travel and created storyboards for the spaceflight sequence in 2001. Trumbull became the special effects supervisor on the film. So it's not a mistake. I mean, there's real, authentic, today, if you're watching any science fiction TV show, like I'm watching The Expanse, and you look at the way the ships move, or the lack of sound in space, or how like every spaceship now has like all these insignias, like it says docking bay 31, airlock, putting little details like that, that all comes from 2001. Space flight, when you're thinking of the Apollo astronauts, remember, they don't land on the moon until 69. So this film actually comes like at this point, yeah, NASA is sending men into space and they're floating around, they're orbiting, but it's nowhere nearly, if you look at those early Apollo missions, the Gemini missions, it's much rougher and nowhere nearly as clean or as sleek as what we'd come to do. I was going to say, he uses a lot of modernist furniture and modernist clothing. Kubrick picked all the furniture and clothing. He was a real auteur, and
Kubrick was very meticulous. Like, I've seen a bunch of documentaries about Kubrick, read about him. He's concerned with every single detail in his movies, like down to the fonts. Like, he's obsessed even with the fonts.
The fonts are the fonts those fonts are the fonts that now you see in every science fiction movie. It's called Eurostile Bold, extended, and Futura, they're all what they are called as sans serif typefaces.
Sans serif, yes.
So the computer displays show high resolution fonts, color, and graphics that were far more in advance than what computers were capable of in the 1960s. There are flat screens in this film. Flat screens. There's not even flat screens in Star Trek Next Generation, okay? Think about that.
Kubrick is quite obsessed in this movie with trying to visually depict the future accurately, and I don't know. I mean, what do you think? You think he did a good job?
I'm getting a little bit away from the theme, but yes, I think that he gets beyond the idea of he's not that emotional. You know what I'm saying? The dialogue is bland. It's a very cold film. In fact, people who don't like it, they respond to the coolness of it. But he just wants to show. I think it's just a much more, in some senses, the technology. A lot of what he shows, we didn't even get to the consumerism. There is picture phones. There's a Howard Johnson's. There are recognizable. It's a TWA space flight. So he did his best to take. The 60s is known as a very big era in technology because it's the beginning of the space race and the use of artificial plastics. Computing does really start to rise. IBM, which, by the way, IBM is is the three letters that come after is the three letters that come before IBM. So there is a lot of, in the 60s, there's a lot of consumerism and belief that technology is going to promise a better way of living. And it definitely, when you see that opening shot of the space plane, oh my God, it made me wish, by the way, really depressing. That TWA flight to the moon is so much better than any of my Alaska Air flights to New York from LAX. The quality of service is superior, but that is what the world was like. That it's not going to be all horrifying, and it's going to be very bland and boring, like you predicted. But then you get to the AI, and the AI, this is where it really becomes fascinating because Hal takes over the ship. Hal follows the program, and because Hal is not a human, he doesn't subscribe to human ethics. And in his quest to get to Jupiter, to Io, he has no problem killing crew members. He realized that the human element is the factor that gets in the way of doing his job. And it's really, I think, that it's one of the first films that really says, why do we assume that our human values are going to just be absorbed by our machines?
Yeah, so 2001 is like one of the, I don't know how it may be one of the first like AI is the big baddie movies. It's definitely
but he's not, I would say he's not bad. You could say that. I think it's more that we've been up until this point assuming that our human ethics and values are just going to be logical and intuitive to machinery.
Yeah, so that's an interesting interpretation. I could definitely see that. So 2001 is suggesting, the future's great. We got this great technology, but maybe this technology will go beyond us. It'll outgrow us, and it won't even need us anymore at a certain point.
But it's also quite dark, right? Because it starts out with all the great. It's like a horror movie. Everything starts out wonderful, and then when you get into the third act, you're trapped with a killer.
Well, I think it's a little bit all this fear of AI. I think is completely overblown, but you see this definite trend in science fiction. I mean, people have this anxiety about technology that it'll, I don't know, do something bad.
But
it'll do something we don't want it to do.
But what's fascinating about Hal is the banality of evil. Open the pod doors, Hal. And what does he say, Dave?
I think he says, "I can't do that, Dave."
I can't. But the actor, he says it in such a polite, pleasing, Siri-esque voice, right? It's that Siri voice before Siri that tells you no.
Well, what's funny about that is anybody who's ever had a problem on their computer can relate. It's like it's like you try to do something, it says error.
Yeah.
Error number 7705. It's like, okay, thanks, computer.
But if you were to ask Siri, like, hey, what's the temperature right now? I can't get. I'll get back to you. I don't have the information. You know, it's that. It's that. What do you mean you're going to disagree with me? But it's up until that period in history, computers were either super good or super evil. And here they're saying, no, computers do not subscribe to the same ethical philosophy that we do. And that's a very scary notion. And that is why I think it's quite brilliant. Two other films, both directed by Ridley Scott, that kind of deal a little bit with this, but we don't really have a lot of time, is Alien, which also has a retro-futuristic look, where people are wearing very boring clothing, bland, kind of like we would. And again, you have androids in it, you have artificial intelligence. And then Blade Runner, same idea, how much the future looks like the present. And again, you have AI. And again, you have the question of consciousness and what makes a human a human.
You know, yeah, I just want to say, yeah, aesthetically speaking, Alien, Blade Runner, and Star Wars, even A New Hope, they're like kind of like the opposite of Kubrick's aesthetically perfect future movies.
So I would point out that Star Wars is fantasy, whereas Blade Runner, which takes place in the year 2019, I forgot what century the Nostromo is, though that's a really great callback to Jules Verne. But it's to show basically what Kubrick is showing, which is the more we move further into the future, the more we stay the same in spite of our technology. But let's get to the next pick, which you picked, which is Soylent Green.
Yeah, so Soylent Green comes out in 1973. Charlton Heston, who's the star of this movie, he belongs to a society. You can look this up, but he belongs to a society that's completely obsessed with our humanity's pending catastrophe, which is like a combination of overpopulation and global warming and famine and poverty, class stratification, and you see that in Soylent Green. So all those factors, Soylent Green goes into the future. I forget how far in the future, but
it's the year 2022.
Okay,
I'm sorry, 2024. It takes place in New York City. So the book, which was written in '68, called Get Out by Harrison. What was his name? Famous science fiction writer who wrote The Steel Rat. Anyway, Harry Harrison or something like that. I'm sorry, we'll post it later, the actual name of the author. But in his book, Soylent Green, it's called Get Out, and it takes place in New York City in 1999 when the Earth's population is in the billions, and New York City has a population of 35 million. And then in the film, they move it to the year 2024, where New York City has a population of 35 million. And again, the Earth's population is in the billions. When the book was written and when the movie came out, the Earth's population was about 3 billion. So right now, the Earth's population is about 8 billion.
And I would like to add, too, that I think the year was 2024. So that's not an accident. I mean, we're about to get into the time when, even back then, it was predicted that global warming would really start to have an effect on our planet.
And while New York City's population has, strangely enough, remained fairly consistent at around between 7 and 8 million people, which doesn't, actually, technically speaking, the population of New York City is actually adjusted for the America's population or the world population. New York's population is decreasing. But if you look at like Mexico City or Hong Kong or Beijing or Mumbai, there are many cities in the world that are very, very similar to the New York of Soylent Green, where you have 20 million or more people living with no middle class.
Well, you know, I just want to say, make a comment about that. The problem of overpopulation was an obsession, not just with Charlton Heston, but a lot of people during that era. You're talking about like 50s, 60s, 70s. And interestingly, people have stopped having as many babies. So the problem of overpopulation has kind of gone away.
Well, it's
because the population has slowed. The population growth has slowed to an extent. And even in the third world, from what I've read, it's slowing. I mean, it's still growing. It's outpacing the industrialized world, the Western world, but it's slowing down everywhere. And
but you have urban overpopulation. which is really at the heart of Soylent Green, and which is actually at the time of this recording, overpopulation in urban areas is as lethal and as dangerous as in any science fiction dystopia you can imagine. We're right now recording this in a time where Randall and I have a 1 in 5 chance of getting sick due to urban overpopulation and possibly die. Not to put too fine a point on it, but as this relates to technology, first off, there's licensed euthanasian centers in this film. And at that time, the normalization of euthanasia seemed crazy. But now we have the DNR. You want to explain what that is?
Yeah, I wish I'd researched this more, but do-not-resuscitate orders exist. I don't know how long they've been around, but the idea behind a do-not-resuscitate is medical doctors can bring you back to life. They have a variety of methods to bring you back to life from different calamities, like your heart stopping or whatever. But if you sign something called a DNR, it'll tell the doctors not to attempt to revive you. So, because medical science is at the point where they can really, they're really good at bringing people back. So, you sign a DNR, your heart stops. They're not going to give you defibrillation, not going to give you chest compressions. They'll just let you go. So that's Soylent Greenish, I would say.
Yeah, there's a character in the film, not played by Charlton Heston, but by you dirty rat. What's his name? Famous actor.
Oh yeah, Borgnine, Ernest Borgnine.
Oh,
right? No, I can't remember.
No.
Oh, you dirty rat. I can't remember. I know who you're talking about.
Anyway, he was also in Moses. He was in the. Oh my God, this sucks. All right, you've got two men with no memory. So, anyway, he plays Saul, who is the older friend of. No, I'm sorry. Let me just seriously do this. He goes to an euthanasian center. Now, we now have licensed assisted suicide places. There are places you can go. Edward G. Robinson, thanks. Where you can go to just end your life. It's that it's legal in many states in the United States to do this. And also, when he goes, before he dies, they show images of trees and forests and things from his life that are no longer around. We now have these things called memory centers, which are used to treat people who have suffered memory loss, who are a little older than us. So at this point, Randall, we might be ready for it, which also creates these sensorama spaces of the way the world used to look to help reconnect people with their memory. The crowd control scenes, the people mover stuff, that level of social crackdown, clearly way still in effect at this point in history. But the thing that I really want to get to that deals with technology in this film is so pernicious, but not in the way you would think, which is literally processed food, and how technology creates processed food and what little care it has for how people are being treated. The 1970s was the first time, one of the big counter reactions in the 70s to the 60s and 50s was the rise of what was called artificial flavoring in food. People were starting to actually want to eat regular food. You know much more about this. Do you want to explain?
Well, this is definitely an interesting way of looking at this. I mean, I think you have a unique look at Soylent Green, but yeah, if you look at so Soylent Green is a world where there are pressures on feeding all the bazillions of people, and thanks to global warming, agriculture's collapsing. So what do? Well, you make this synthetic food, and what do we have today? We have, the synthetic food of Soylent Green. There's a whole thing about that. It's part of the story. You have to watch it. I'm not going to give it away, but we have synthetic food, and our synthetic food does what? Our synthetic food is bad for us too. I mean, it's all our processed food. I mean, this is a theory of processed food I don't think a lot of people talk about. But why is there so much processed food? Why is it so cheap? Well, the government subsidizes it, and we need to eat it because maybe we are running out of food, Chris. I mean, if all the people on our planet today stopped eating processed food, we would not have enough food.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point, right? That's something to think about. Also, at the time that the film came out, there wasn't actual proper labeling. We didn't really know what all the ingredients were in food. Every day you were finding out new horrific things about what was in your
Oh, is that true? You know, I didn't know.
Yeah.
I never knew that, Chris. It's a real interesting point.
Accuracy in food labeling is really something that won't happen for not until the 80s, and it doesn't really get perfected until like the late 90s. So there is a lot of things, and the people who normally get the most processed food, especially during the economic recession of the early 70s, were poor people. Wealthy people were always going to have access to fresh food and good food. And unfortunately, even to this day, the most dangerous processed food always go to the poorest people. And in a weird way, you can even look at, though this is not food, what was it, oxycodone and the Sackler family?
Yeah, the oxy pills they're giving out to everybody.
Right. Yeah, and again, they gave it to people who were poor, suffered the most. They didn't tell them about the dangers of it. There was a lot of people became addicted to opioids. In many ways, just the whole way opioids played out is very similar to Soylent Green. And again, this is a nice one because this basically shows us how the promise of how technology can improve our lives can absolutely be used to control our lives and to damage our lives.
Well, I just want to say, I want to say one more thing about Soylent Green. Soylent Green is a very serious movie. I mean, this is a labor of love for Charlton Heston, who believes in these ideas. He wants to warn us about how horrible our future is going to be if we don't change things. And guess what? This is going to be our future. I think. I really think
he's a Republican. He was a conservative guy.
Yeah, he's a super Republican, but he saw the writing on the wall. He wasn't an idiot. He's still alive, I think, by the way, isn't he?
No, he just passed away
a
few years ago. I do want to talk about two other films that came out of the 70s along these lines. There's so many because the 70s was such a refutation of the 50s and 60s. And also the world of the 1970s was so bleak. And there was technology, but there was poverty, there was drug addiction, there was cities were crumbling. But two films that come out around the same time that kind of also touch on this is Rollerball, which came out in 75, stars James Caan, where corporations now run the world. There are no longer states, and they sponsor a blood sport named Rollerball, which is not a real sport, but it's a combination of roller derby and football, for lack of a better word. It looks very realistic. And in that one, there is a computer and there's some technology, but really, and that's why it probably didn't make it to the cut, it really shows, again, how corporations really start to become the great controllers of our world. And it's weird today, but when you see corporate sponsorships of sports teams, the link is just right there and there. And then Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, the penultimate in the series of Planet of the Apes movies, which is filmed in Century City right here in Los Angeles. That takes place when the apes are now capable of doing human functions and they become a worker class. But they don't have any rights. They're an oppressed group of people who are simply used as domestics and servants. And again, it's great use of technology. It's not really covers technology as much as if these apes evolved, how we could exploit them as workers.
Yeah, Conquest is a great sequel in the ape movies. I mean, it comes out of nowhere. When you start watching the ape movies, you think, well, they're just going to make crappier and crappier sequels. But Conquest is so much fun. I mean,
and like Kubrick, both Rollerball and Conquest don't really get too heavy into the tech. You know, they use contemporary clothing, they have helicopters, they use real buildings that are just part of the modernist movement or postmodernist. Actually, no. Yeah, they use postmodernist buildings that were built in the 60s and 70s that are very modern. They use designer clothing, just like Kubrick. I mean, it's sleek modernism so that we can see ourselves in it. And then we're going to take a humongous jump right into the 21st century. And this is your pick from 2006, Idiocracy.
So Idiocracy, if you haven't seen it, it is a great. I think it's a great movie. It's the whole idea is that it's similar to Looking Backward, where and Woody Allen's Sleeper, we'll talk about in a minute, where somebody falls asleep and they wake up in the future, hundreds of years in the future, and the future is different now. In Idiocracy, the population has become a lot stupider. The average IQ has gone down to what, like 60 or something? I forget what it is. But as IQ has gone down, technology has improved. So you're in a world where technology is like off the charts amazing. I mean, it practically fixes itself, takes care of itself, but people are complete morons. I mean, they don't know how anything works, and it's all right. Everything works all right in this world until, well, you have to watch it, but until certain things happen that only somebody of an average IQ or time travelers woken up in the future can fix.
And it's interesting. This one technically doesn't count because it takes place sometime in 500 years in the future. So we don't know yet how accurate it will be. But it deals with the concept of dysgenics, which can be traced back to things like the time machine, which I didn't talk about. Was it the Muloks or the Elos in that who are?
Well, there's the Eloi in H.G. Wells' Time Machine. He goes into the future where there's where the classes where human beings are split into two social classes that are physically distinct as well. The Eloi and the Morlocks, and it's quite fascinating actually. I mean, wouldn't you say the Time Machine is just a great read?
It is. It's a great read. It's a great movie. If you see the 1962 film, not the one that came out.
Yeah, 62 film's fun. Yeah.
Guy Pearce is terrible.
I love the book, though. I love the book. I think the book is unbeatable.
But I would say that, that concept, and that actually is supposed to be the 20th century. And then even in Aldous Huxley's Brave New Worlds, you have the epsilon minus semi-morons. So this is technology, and Idiocracy is really smart about it, because whereas the de-evolution of human beings in the other works that we're talking about seem more due to privation, here Judge is really showing how technology is going to make us dumber.
Well, it is an open question in Idiocracy. I mean, Idiocracy doesn't have a lot of answers. I feel like Idiocracy just presents you with this scenario where it's like a mirror. It's a reflection of ourselves almost. I mean, how much do we actually know about how the technology around us works? I mean, most people are fairly ignorant of it, and it's a great satire, just like 1984. It's a great satire, and we're along the lines of 2001, where technology has somehow outpaced us as humans. It's like there's a projection of technology, okay, that I think AI is touching on. The AI horror stories touch on, where technology becomes so we make technology so complicated that it goes way beyond us, and we don't understand it anymore.
And it not only goes beyond us, but it doesn't bring us along in that world. It doesn't improve us. It just basically makes us more into children and infants.
That's the fear. It leaves us, right? It leaves us forever.
And that's a good transition for the last film, which I picked, which is Her by Spike Jonze. It comes out in 2013. It has a really interesting backstory about what caused Spike Jonze to do this film. It takes place in a Los Angeles in the not too distant future, meaning, it's sometime, but we don't know exactly when, but it should be in our lifetime. It was filmed in Los Angeles and Shanghai. And the look of the film, there's no blue in it because the designer had felt that blue had been too common in science fiction films. So there is a lot of red. The technology that you see is very little, all things considered. But this is a film about AI, and it's very different than the other films that we've talked about, and it's also revisits. You could call it a comedy. But something to really think about was, okay, so Jones, in the early 2000s, he read an article online that mentioned a website where a user could instant message with an artificial intelligence. For the first maybe 20 seconds, it had this real buzz, said Jones. I said, hello, and it would say, hey, how are you? And it was like, whoa, this is trippy. After 20 seconds, it quickly fell apart, and you realized actually works, And it wasn't that impressive. But still, for 20 seconds, really exciting. The more people that talked to it, the smarter it got. Jones's interest in the project was renewed after directing a short film, I'm Here, in 2010, which shares a similar themes. Inspiration also came from Charlie Kaufman's writing approach for Synecdoche, where you write down all your thoughts about what you're feeling. So the thing about this movie, Her, is the shortest way I can say it is that Joaquin Phoenix plays a man who writes emotional letters for people who cannot write well, who cannot articulate their emotions. He's going through a divorce. He has bitter feelings towards his ex-wife. He is emotionally shut down. He's trying to get back into the world of human connectivity, and he's very disconnected. His ex-girlfriend from college lives next door and is the closest thing he has to a friend. But he gets a virtual assistant, and the virtual assistant slowly takes over and helps him. Now, this is a really interesting film, and I don't want to give too much away because we've been doing a really good job of being spoiler free. But this is not a situation where an AI has no human feelings, nor is this a situation where an AI is malevolent or benevolent. Well, slightly benevolent, but she is trying to understand what it's like to be a human being through her interactions with the Joaquin Phoenix character, but she's also trying to learn him and help him have a better life. And she's not just trying to have him have a better life by getting out and dating, but just literally helping him become a better person. And in the process of the film, we do see what happens when technology does surpass us. But it doesn't surpass us in a controlling way. It evolves into a higher consciousness and brings Joaquin Phoenix along for that ride, not to make him superhuman or a super genius, but to make him a better version of himself, a more functional version of himself, someone who can really be his best self. And I find it really fascinating because it comes out in 2013, and yes, he's done his research, but a lot of what we consider to be, Siri and virtual assistants and all of that doesn't really start taking over our lives until the second half of that decade. Yes, Siri did come out, but it didn't really become as popular. Alexa hadn't come out yet. There's a really interesting fact I just want to read to you. Give me a second. Let me see, where is this? According to Bloomberg's Jack Clarke, 2015 was a landmark year for artificial intelligence, with a number of software projects that use AI with Google increased from sporadic usage in 2012, the year before the movie came out, to 2,700 projects. Yes, by this point in history, Deep Blue had defeated Garry Kasparov in chess. In just a few more years, an AI would defeat a Go master in Go. But today, I remember when I was single, I used to look at people's dating profiles, and it would literally, the question is like something you can't do without, and people would always put down their iPhone. Let's be blunt. Like when I ask Siri a question, I will often say, "Thank you, Siri." Siri can't hear me, but Siri can hear me, and our relationship, at least at this point, to our AI isn't that different than our relationship to our favorite bear when we were a kid, or stuffed bear, or favorite toy. What are your thoughts on this film? I've been talking way too much.
That was beautiful, Chris. I think you've really summed it up. It's Her really tries to look at where our relationship with technology might go. I mean, beyond 2001 even.
Yeah, and the way that it surpasses us in 2001 is slightly nefarious. But there are two films that come out soon after this movie that also kind of deal with virtual assistants or AI as a helper of humanity. And one of them is Robot and Frank, where It's about an ex-con with memory problems whose children buy him a robot to help him remember things, played by Frank Langella. And he actually helps using that. It's a very clever film. I don't want to give too much away. And Marjorie Prime, which comes out in 2017, which is an AI played by John Hamm, of a woman who's starting to have memory issues, but it's a recreation of her husband who passed away. And it helps her not so much with memory as much as dealing with coming to terms with her own past. So now we're really in this era where AI is no longer about world domination. And in fact, the last two films we talked about really have less to do with the role of government in society. And they're much more humanistic. They really have to do more with how technology is not going to make us less human, but how technology helps us get in touch. All three of the films I just mentioned, how technology helps us get in touch with our own humanity.
Well, I think it's good to see AI stop being villainized in science fiction, I think. Yeah. I mean, because it's not going to, I don't think it's going to be like the Terminator and create the end of the world. I think it's a little silly.
I think it's really fascinating when you go from 1888 to 2017, and you really see this giant sweeping span of the promise of technology is overblown, the fear of technology is a little overblown, some of the promise of technology definitely plays out, and some of the fear of technology, as we mentioned, plays out. I don't think we've really reached Moore's law, which what is Moore's law?
I've been reading about that. There's evidence that we are reaching the end of Moore's law. So, and computer tech hasn't really improved that much in the last even 10 years. Not like it used to.
You want to explain what Moore's law is? Just
there was an engineer, I think, at IBM who I think it was in the early 80s. He did some math and he realized that CPUs, I think it was, were improving at a certain average. They were doubling in speed every year or something like that. And he charted it out on a graph just how good CPUs would be 20, 30, 50 years in the future, whatever it was. And everybody was surprised when 10, 20 years out, Moore's law still seemed to hold. But and I think it is holding, but it's definitely slowing down because the materials can only go so far. But we'll see what happens.
The robots are in some ways running our life, and in some ways they're not. God knows, I know I'm literally strapped to my iPhone 24/7, where the internet controls my behavior, records my behavior, tells me what to think and do. I definitely am like a cyborg in some senses, but I don't have a jetpack. I haven't been to the moon. I still don't have a holographic television, which really freaking pisses me off.
A 3D TV came and went already.
I know. I actually had the goggles, and they gave me a headache. It was terrible. So I mean, that's the thing. I mean, all of the works that we talked about are also a product of the time they were written, and that's the beautiful thing about art. Not as much of the arts and entertainment really look to the future as we had thought they would, but these particular ones, we chose them. There's so many we could have done, and we will do other episodes about futurism. This is not the last, but we wanted to just talk about these specific examples because I felt like they so elucidate the 3 points of whether or not technology will control us, improve us, or surpass us. And at the end of the day, what's beautiful about art is you're not having to worry about what's reasonable. You can talk about your dreams, your fears, and your nightmares. And I feel like all of these works have done that. So
and I just want to add one more thing. A lot of the future that these works envision, they seem to come to pass just because it's like there's a loop, right? I mean, people predict these things in the future because these are things people want to happen, and then we make them happen.
Yeah,
right.
And the things that they get right has less to do, I would argue, with the technology, and more to do with the behavior of humans. Because whilst technology is inherently, we just don't know. It moves and not moves at a speed in which none of us can accurately predict. Human behavior oh man, that stays consistent. We're not really that far from the world of the late 19th century that Bellamy is writing. And that is why these works are still resonant today. Randall, any final words?
No, that's it. You got it, Chris.
All right. Well, from the futuristic year of 2021, but really from the past as you're now listening to it, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
We'll talk again soon.
All right, bye.